Viktor Orban has become the Johnny Depp of European politics. Hungary's Prime Minister has long been attracting the attention of Brussels and other European capitals, and not exactly for his kindness. These days, the Hungarian's only fans seems to be in Poland. For years, Orban has been allowed everything in the European Union, from letting him grab all the power in Hungary to seeing the Hungarian government itself pay for campaigns against Juncker when he was the president of the European Commission. Campaigns paid for, of course, with public money. And obviously, all this is something that stings in Brussels, especially if we take into account that Hungary is one of the main recipients of funds from the European Union. The problem for Orban is that now so many years of excess are beginning to take their toll. His latest decision to ban all content deemed to promote homosexuality to minors is proving to be the last straw. Brussels at last seems determined to take the Orban issue very, very seriously. And you're probably thinking, what exactly do they have in mind? Are they going to ban Will and Grace? Well, just to give you an idea, not even Harry Potter seems to be spared from censorship. All this has made us at VisualPolitik ask ourselves a few questions. What on earth is the Hungarian government looking for? Is the criticism of Orban justified? What role can the European Union play? And perhaps the most important question of all, what could happen in the future? Today on VisualPolitik, we're going to answer these questions. But first, let's take a look at a bit of history.
Orban, the bastion against communism.
There was a time when Viktor Orban was a symbol of the struggle for freedom. It was the 1980s, and Hungary was still a communist regime under the influence of the Soviet Union. However, at that time, the Eastern Bloc was already beginning to crumble, and it is onto this stage that we see the entry of the young Viktor Orban, one of the founders of the Fidesz party, the Young Democrats. Orban was considered one of the most charismatic dissidents, and sporting a full head of hair. At the age of 26, he took part in the state tribute to the remains of the leaders of the 1956 Hungarian Revolution, with a strong speech against communism and in favor of democracy.
Ha hiszünk a magunk erejében, képesek vagyunk véget vetni a kommunista diktatúrának, ha elég eltökéltek vagyunk, rászoríthatjuk az uralkodó pártot, hogy alávesse magát a szabad választásoknak, ha nem tévesztjük szem elől 56 eszméit, olyan kormányt választhatunk magunknak, amely azonnali tárgyalásokat kezd az orosz csapatok kivonásának haladéktalan megkezdéséről.
Indeed, the Soviet socialist regime fell, and Fidesz became a political party. But in the first elections, they didn't do well at all. So, change of course. Orban abandoned his liberal stance to turn Fidesz into the major party of the conservative right in Hungary. And you know what? It worked. In 1998, Orban became the Prime Minister of Hungary. It was a first term of 4 years with good economic data, and it was a period which advanced the post-communist modernization of Hungary. Their good work even caught the attention of the European People's Party, the grouping of centre-right parties in the European Parliament. So they went to Budapest to convince Orban that he belonged with them, and not the liberals. And that's how Fidesz became part of the European People's Party. Life was smiling on Orban, except for one small drawback. He lost the elections to keep his government in power, and in 2006, he lost them again. It was time for yet another change in course in the way of doing politics. From that moment on, the approach was much more radical, combative, and why not just say it, populist. So when he regained power in 2010, he did it in a big way. He did so with a 2/3 supermajority in parliament, giving him enough power to change the constitution at will. And as you well know, young Democrats of the world who are watching us, that is the worst superpower that can be given to any politician, because since then, we only get new stories like this from Hungary.
Hungary's judges warn of threats to judicial independence.
Running the government from his position as Prime Minister and the parliament with that 2/3 supermajority, Orban has always had the judiciary in his sights. To begin with, he created a national office for the judiciary with the ability to veto judicial promotions and influence the distribution of cases. So the judges are standing up to the government? Well, he suddenly brought forward their retirement age by 8 years. So the Constitutional Court continues to put up a fight? Well, he expanded the number of judges and reserved the vacancies for those most sympathetic to Fidesz. One way or another, Viktor Orban always seems to have the last word. In this way, the separation of executive powers in Hungary has been progressively losing strength. Every time it has received a setback, Fidesz used its supermajority to shield Orban's agenda by amending the constitution. But Orban's stranglehold on Hungarian democracy does not end there. The elections, for example, are free, yes, but not balanced. The State Audit Office, headed by a former Fidesz deputy, has investigated opposition parties and even fined them millions of dollars, stifling them financially. Something that, of course, it has never done to the party in government. Coincidence? So, is Hungary a dictatorship? Well, no, obviously not, but there are details that speak for themselves. For example, since Viktor Orban came to power, some 2 million Hungarians living in neighbouring Eastern European countries have been given voting rights. They are allowed to vote by post. Most of them are guaranteed Fidesz supporters. However, the approximately 350,000 Hungarian citizens living in Western Europe have to go to embassies and consulates to vote. Easy for some, difficult for others. There's no vote rigging and no liquidation of opposition leaders, but Orban doesn't even need it. Many newspapers critical of his leadership have closed down, and Fidesz has transformed MTI, the country's public news agency, into a propaganda machine, whose service, to top it all off, is free of charge, which has killed off competing news agencies. Plain and simple, he's used the oldest strategy in politics: unfair competition paid for with public money. And of course, as you can imagine, the smaller newspapers, the regional ones, all of them are supplied to a large extent with news from this government agency. So of course, the content is always favourable to the government, and with radio and television, it's practically the same story. So there you have it. Orban has it all under control. But hold on a minute, because things have changed since March when this happened.
Orban's Fidesz leaves EPP group before being kicked out.
Until last March, Orban benefited from being part of the political group that dominates the European Parliament and has the greatest ability to open doors to the European Commission. It was an awkward ally for the European centre-right, but after all, Hungary's Fidesz was the party that contributed the third highest number of MEPs to the European People's Party. However, it seems his partners in Brussels have now had enough of Orban's challenges. Hold on, what kind of challenges are we talking about? Well, listen up.
Orban, the Hungarian nationalist.
There are two reasons why Hungarians vote for Orban. One has a lot to do with emotions. For many Hungarians, being a supporter of Viktor Orban and the Fidesz, two bastions of national independence, is something akin to being a good patriot. But of course, let's not fool ourselves. Time goes by, and with the Soviet Union being more dissolved than the Beatles since Yoko Ono set foot in Great Britain, you can understand that motivating Hungarians with the spectre of the communist enemy is something that was losing its appeal. And this is where Orban's political acumen comes to the fore. What does it take to stay in power? It's clear, isn't it? Make a new enemy. And as we say around here, no sooner said than done. Do you remember the European refugee crisis a few years ago? Well, this was Viktor Orban's main contribution.
If you take masses of non-registered immigrants from the Middle East into your country, you are importing terrorism, crime, anti-Semitism, and homophobia. Viktor Orban.
I don't know, what do you want me to say? Beyond the prejudices contained in statements like this, doesn't seem like the best way for a political leader to address a refugee crisis resulting from a bloody civil war, even if you don't agree with sheltering those people. A little bit of compassion doesn't go amiss. The fact is that Orban built a barbed wire barrier on the border to prevent refugees from entering Hungary, all in defense of what the Hungarian leader considers a counter-revolution directed against those who rule in Brussels in order to preserve the Christian character of Europe. And that was not to be the end of it. Orban has repeatedly attacked US investor George Soros as a symbol of globalism. Soros owns the Central European University, Hungary's most prestigious university, which Fidesz has banished from the country for promoting values that do not coincide with those of the government. And many of you may be thinking, isn't it a bit eccentric to single out a guy who lives in New York as Hungary's public enemy number one? Well, maybe, but while Hungarians are preoccupied dealing with supposed enemies like Soros or the poor refugees, reports from OLAF, the European Anti-Fraud Office, suggest that the Hungarian government is not wasting any time.
Olaf data about EU fund use irregularities slam Hungary again.
Everything points to the fact that Fidesz has made its inner circle rich with money from Europe. And many of you will say, well, most people don't like it when politicians put their hands in the till. How come they keep voting for him? Well, this brings us to the second reason why Hungarians vote for Orban. And And the truth is that, while he has been Prime Minister, the Hungarian economy has made progress. Unemployment is around 4%, which is music to the ears of Hungarians, who returned Orban to power in the midst of the Great Recession. What's more, Orban's Hungary was growing at an average of 3% until the arrival of the COVID-19 pandemic. Does it have merit? Well, it depends. If, for example, we take into account that every year Hungary receives the equivalent of about 3% of its GDP in European aid, well, they would have to be managing it very badly, as they are one of the countries that receives the most money from the European Union. Take a look. For a guy who's so much at odds with those in charge in Brussels, it's not bad, is it? Anyway, we will talk about the Hungarian economy in a future video, so don't forget to subscribe to receive those notifications. The thing is that the Fidesz party could be on the verge of losing control of the situation after the arrival of the pandemic. We've already told you that it is no longer a member of the European People's Party, the largest group in the European Parliament. But other countries are also getting fed up with Orban's attacks on Brussels and the way in which European taxpayers' money is being pocketed by the Hungarian Prime Minister's colleagues. So in the negotiations regarding post-pandemic recovery funds, MEPs introduced never-before-seen demands.
Deal reached to link EU funding to respect the rule of law.
The Hungarian government has pulled out all the stops to prevent this regulation from going ahead, but everything indicates that Orban's European star is about to fall. What is worse for him, he now has other worries to deal with. Listen up.
Orban, the electoral strategist.
Hungary was in the news a lot during the last European Championship. The bad thing is that it was more for political reasons than for sporting success. Viktor Orban's government has just passed a law banning the exposure of minors to any content that gives visibility to homosexuality. The outrage was enormous in much of Europe, and the Euro Cup was the stage on which Orban found the most popular expression of the community's rejection of his homophobic legislation. Remember that Munich wanted to illuminate its stadium with the colours of the rainbow flag, and that the German goalkeeper wore an armband with these colours during the match in which they played against Hungary. A similar gesture was made by driver Sebastian Vettel at the Hungarian Formula 1 Grand Prix. The truth is that many European governments and the European Commission itself have a soft spot for Orban. A few years ago, there was an attempt to take action against the Hungarian government in the European Parliament, but nothing happened. However, the situation is quite different now. When in 2018, the European Parliament decided to trigger Article 7 sanctions against Hungary, it ran into an insurmountable obstacle. The decision had to be taken by consensus of the other member states of the European Union, an impossible mission in the face of the Budapest-Warsaw Alliance. Now things have changed with the new regulation. Member states will now have to respect the rule of law and the fundamental values of the European project, such as respect for minorities, or the European Commission will be able to block them from receiving EU funds with the approval of a qualified majority. Of course, the Orban government will put up a fight. At first, it blocked the approval of the community budget and the aid for post-pandemic recovery, because they did not want to see this demand for respect for the rule of law. But in the end, they had to give in, because they are aware that the arrival of European funds, a veritable fortune, is vital for the Hungarian economy. Orban did manage to extract one concession, however. The European Court of Justice has to approve the legality of this new requirement for receiving EU money. All this looks set to delay the deadline for the European Commission to stand up to the despotic-like member states by a couple of years. And of course, it is still too early to tell whether this will remain the typical regulation that Brussels is so fond of. Strict rules to please the most demanding, and a very flexible application to reassure the critics. Slovakia's president has the same doubts.
Having the mechanism to defend the rule of law in place is just the first step. Now we need to make it work. Zuzana Čaputová, president of Slovakia.
In any case, if Viktor Orban has won anything in his tug of war with the other leaders of the European Union, it is time. Time for the demand for respect for the rule of law not to be implemented before spring, which is when the next elections will be held in Hungary.
Hungarian opposition unites in bid to unseat Viktor Orban.
We'll keep an eye on events, but now it's your turn. Do you think that the European Union will finally dare to stand up to Viktor Orban? Or do you think that each country should be in charge of deciding its own path, whatever that path may be? You can leave us your answer in the comments. And if you found this video interesting, please like it, and don't forget to subscribe to VisualPolitik if you haven't already done so. All the best, see you next time.